Listen carefully, because the next moment is not asking you to chase something new. It is asking you to recognize what is already leaving your life. August 12th may become one of the most significant, energetic turning points of the entire year, because a total solar eclipse is taking place in Leo, with the moon moving directly between Earth and the Sun, and completely covering the Sun for a brief period, creating that extraordinary moment when daylight gives way to darkness in the middle of the day. But the visible darkness is only the surface of what is happening. Beneath it, there is an energetic movement that can reach into your emotions, your relationships, your identity, and the parts of yourself you may have been carrying long after they stop belonging to you. You may not feel prepared for it, and you may not even understand what is changing while it is happening, but that does not mean the shift is not real. What makes this eclipse especially important is that it is occurring directly on the South Node, and that detail changes the way these next 48 hours should be approached. A South Node eclipse is not simply an invitation to imagine what you want and immediately reach for more. It carries a very different message. It brings attention toward release, toward endings, toward old emotional patterns, familiar identities, and attachments that may once have protected you, but have now become something you keep repeating without realizing it. This is why treating this moment exactly like an ordinary new moon could completely miss the deeper purpose of what is unfolding. Many people will instinctively begin writing intentions, creating manifestation lists, asking for something new to arrive, and trying to force the future into existence. But the deeper question is not yet what you should add to your life. The deeper question is what you are finally ready to stop carrying. Before you can understand why this eclipse matters, you also need to recognize that its story did not begin today. The atmosphere surrounding this event has already been building, and if the last several days have left you unusually unsettled, emotionally sensitive, distant, or strangely aware of something you could not quite name, you may already have been experiencing the beginning of the shift. Since around August 10th, something may have felt different inside your relationships. Perhaps a conversation that normally would have passed without difficulty suddenly became uncomfortable. Perhaps someone you trust said something that landed with surprising force, making you question what you thought you understood about them. Perhaps nothing obvious happened at all, yet you woke up with a heaviness in your chest, carrying the quiet sense that something between you and another person was no longer what you believed it to be. That feeling may have been difficult to explain, because the change was not necessarily happening outside of you first. It may have been happening in the way you were perceiving what was already there. On August 10th, Venus formed an exact opposition to Neptune, and this transit is associated with the breaking apart of illusions, particularly illusions connected to relationships. It can bring attention to the stories you create about people, the expectations you place around partnerships, the fantasies you maintain because reality feels less satisfying, and the tendency to become attached not to who someone truly is, but to who you believe that person could eventually become. Sometimes the hardest realization is not discovering that someone changed. It is discovering that you were looking at them through a story you had created. That realization can be painful because the emotional attachment may have been completely real, even when the picture you held in your mind was not. There is another important layer to what happened. Only a few hours before the Venus and Neptune opposition became exact, Venus also formed a trine with Pluto. Pluto carries an energy of excavation, forcing hidden material upward and bringing uncomfortable truths into awareness. This means the process was not simply a gentle disappearance of fantasy. Something deeper was first pulled out from underneath the surface, and then Neptune dissolved what could no longer remain intact. You may therefore have experienced the last couple of days as unusually intense, especially if a relationship suddenly revealed a truth that you had avoided seeing. A person may not have changed overnight, but your ability to overlook what was already there may have disappeared. A situation may not have suddenly become different, but your willingness to explain it away may have weakened. That distinction matters. Sometimes clarity feels like loss, because the mind has been using hope to protect the heart. When that hope falls away, there can be a strange emptiness before anything new has had the chance to take its place. You may find yourself replaying conversations, questioning your own judgment, wondering whether you misunderstood someone, or asking why something that once felt meaningful now appears so different. This emotional discomfort does not necessarily mean something has gone wrong. It can mean that an illusion is no longer strong enough to keep your attention away from reality. Think of it as looking through a window that has been covered in dust for so long that you stop noticing the dirt. Then, suddenly, the glass is cleaned, and the view becomes almost startlingly sharp. The landscape did not necessarily change. Your ability to see it did. That is the kind of clarity these recent movements can symbolize. It may not feel gentle, but it can be necessary. You cannot genuinely move towards something new while continuing to organize your life around something that was never as real as you believed it was. This is why the emotional tension of the last few days should not automatically be interpreted as punishment, rejection, or meaningless heartbreak. The deeper meaning is preparation. The illusion had to be exposed before you could recognize what needed to be released. The truth had to become visible before you could make a different choice. And now, the total solar eclipse in Leo arrives directly on the south node, taking that process of release and bringing it into a much larger moment. This is where the usual new moon approach becomes insufficient. A normal new moon is often associated with beginnings, intentions, seeds, possibilities, and the decision to invite something into your future. But this is not simply a normal new moon. It is a total solar eclipse, and it is positioned directly on the south node. The symbolism therefore moves in another direction. Instead of immediately asking what you want to manifest, you may need to become honest about what you have already outgrown. Instead of demanding a new identity, you may need to recognize the identity you no longer need to perform. Instead of trying to hold everything together, you may need to allow certain patterns to complete themselves. The South Node is connected with release, karma, and the process of moving away from patterns, identities, and ways of being that have reached the end of their usefulness. This can be uncomfortable because familiarity often feels safer than freedom. Even when a pattern is exhausting, the mind can prefer the pain it knows over the uncertainty it does not. You may understand intellectually that something needs to end while emotionally continuing to reach for it. You may know that a certain version of yourself has become too small, yet still feel afraid of who you will be without it. That is why this eclipse can feel so personal. It is not merely asking you to observe an astronomical event. It is confronting the emotional attachments that keep you connected to what you have already surpassed. The coming hours are therefore less about forcing an outcome and more about allowing recognition to happen. What has been revealed through your relationship since August 10th may now become part of a much larger realization. The eclipse does not need you to manufacture the lesson. The lesson may already be standing directly in front of you. Your task is to notice it, to understand what it is showing you, and to recognize what you have been ready to release, even if you were afraid to admit it. And as this eclipse moves you deeper into that realization, the next layer of this story becomes impossible to ignore. When an eclipse arrives on the South Node, the movement is not primarily about bringing something closer to you. It is about creating enough force for something to move out of your life. And that distinction may become the most important thing for you to understand about what is happening now. This is especially powerful because the eclipse is occurring in Leo, a sign deeply connected with identity, self-expression, visibility, confidence, and the way you choose to present yourself to the world. Leo speaks to the character you step into when other people are watching, the roles you accept, the image you maintain, and the version of yourself you have learned to display in order to receive recognition. That is why this eclipse can reach far beyond a simple change of circumstances. It can confront the difference between who you genuinely are and who you have learned to become, because you believed that version would be accepted, admired, or approved of by others. There may be a part of you that has spent years measuring your worth through reactions, attention, praise, recognition, or visible signs that you are doing enough and being enough. You may have become accustomed to performing confidence, even when you were uncertain inside. You may have learned how to appear successful while quietly wondering whether the person everyone applauds is actually the person you want to be. This eclipse is bringing pressure to that contradiction. It is not gently suggesting that you reconsider the performance. It is demanding that you examine it honestly and recognize what remains when the performance is no longer necessary. The version of yourself that constantly searches for approval may have been useful once. Perhaps it helped you survive an environment where being noticed meant feeling secure. Perhaps it taught you how to adapt, impress, lead, or maintain an image that gave you a sense of belonging. But there comes a point when the identity created for acceptance becomes too restrictive for the person you have actually grown into. That is where this eclipse can become deeply transformative. It can begin stripping away the layers that were built around the authentic self, not because those layers were meaningless, but because they are no longer capable of carrying you forward. You may notice yourself becoming less interested in proving your worth. You may become less willing to chase attention, simply because attention once made you feel valuable. You may begin questioning why certain forms of recognition matter so much to you, and why you feel unsettled when nobody is watching. Those questions can feel uncomfortable because they expose the emotional machinery behind the image you present. Yet underneath that entire structure is something much quieter and much more genuine. There is a version of you that does not need an audience to exist. There is a part of you that does not need applause before it can believe in itself. That deeper self may have been waiting beneath years of expectation, performance, and external validation, waiting for enough of the old identity to fall away so that you could finally recognize it. This does not mean you will suddenly wake up on August 13th as an entirely different person. There is no certainty that everything changes overnight. The shift may be much more subtle, but that does not make it less meaningful. What may begin changing is your relationship with yourself. The need to demonstrate, impress, explain, or receive approval may begin losing some of its authority over you. Something that once felt essential may suddenly feel exhausting. Something you once chased may no longer seem worth the emotional cost. You may still enjoy recognition, attention, or success, but the difference is that you may begin experiencing them as additions to your identity rather than proof of your identity. That creates an internal space that can feel unusually quiet. At first, that quiet may even feel strange because you will become accustomed to filling it with achievement, reaction, or validation. But eventually, that emptiness can become freedom. You may realize that you do not have to keep performing a version of yourself simply because other people have become comfortable with it. You do not have to remain inside a role simply because you have played it for a long time. And that realization brings us directly to the 3 signs that may experience this eclipse as a particularly important turning point. Although every zodiac sign can feel this eclipse in some form, Leo, Aquarius, and Pisces stand out in different ways, and for each of them, the experience carries a distinct message. If you are a Leo, the eclipse is landing directly on your sign, making this especially personal. The Sun, Moon, Mercury, and Jupiter are all gathered in Leo at this time, creating a powerful stellium. With the eclipse also conjunct the South Node, the focus becomes even more concentrated around what you have outgrown and what you are prepared to release. For Leo, this can challenge one of the most familiar sources of strength, the desire to be seen. The message is not that you should disappear forever, and it is certainly not that you are unworthy of attention. The deeper lesson is that you may no longer need the spotlight to tell you who you are. The applause that once gave you confidence may begin losing its power because something more internal is developing in its place. If you have been holding tightly to a position, a title, a relationship, a reputation, or any identity that no longer feels honest, this eclipse may make the contradiction increasingly difficult to ignore. You may reach a point where maintaining the appearance becomes more exhausting than accepting the truth. That is not a punishment. It can be the beginning of liberation. You are being pushed toward a form of leadership that comes from authenticity rather than performance. And when that happens, you may discover that your strength does not depend on the role you occupy. If you are an Aquarius, your experience unfolds from the opposite side of the eclipse axis. While Leo is moving through a process of release, Aquarius is connected with what is being received through the North Node direction. Yet what comes toward you may not resemble the outcome you originally imagined. The North Node energy is drawing attention toward deeper self-expression and toward becoming more visible in a way that can feel unfamiliar. Aquarius naturally values distance, observation, objectivity, and intellectual understanding. There can be comfort in watching from outside the emotional center, rather than placing your own identity directly into the middle of the experience. But this eclipse can challenge that distance. You may feel an increasing desire to create something that carries your name, to attach your identity to something you have produced, to stop remaining behind the collective, and to speak from your own individual perspective. That can feel vulnerable because being personally visible means you cannot always hide behind ideas, groups, or detached observation. Yet the discomfort itself may reveal where growth is occurring. This is not about becoming egotistical. It is about acknowledging your individuality without apologizing for it. You may be entering a period where blending into the larger group no longer feels satisfying, because your own voice is asking to be recognized by you first. And then there is Pisces, where the significance of this eclipse extends beyond today. While attention is centered on the Leo eclipse, another eclipse is scheduled for August 28th, a lunar eclipse in Pisces. That creates a connection between what begins opening now and what may reach a stronger emotional point for Pisces later in the month. For you, the process may therefore feel less like one isolated moment and more like a story unfolding in stages. What begins breaking open under the Leo eclipse can continue developing until that later lunar eclipse brings the emotional dimension into sharper focus. The first movement may reveal what needs to change, while the later moment may make the emotional consequences harder to ignore. That is why what happens now should not be dismissed, simply because the transformation is not complete immediately. The process has begun, and for Pisces, the deeper emotional peak may arrive approximately 2.5 weeks from now, when the second eclipse brings the story into another phase. You may have reached a point where carrying everyone else no longer feels noble, it simply feels exhausting. And somewhere inside you, I think you already know that something has to change. For a long time, you may have absorbed the moods around you without even realizing it, taking in other people's worries, reacting to their emotional storms, making space for their problems, and quietly setting your own needs aside so that everyone else could remain comfortable. That kind of sensitivity can become so familiar that you stop questioning it. You simply become the person who understands, the person who stays, the person who forgives, the person who gives another chance, the person who carries what nobody else wants to carry. But the Pisces eclipse coming later is connected with releasing exactly that burden, allowing you to recognize what belongs to you and what never did. And the process does not begin on August 28th. It begins here, with the Leo eclipse happening today. This is where those deeply rooted patterns can begin losing their hold. The tendency to sacrifice yourself, to disappear inside someone else's needs, to become the emotional caretaker while your own feelings remain somewhere in the background, can start becoming impossible to maintain. You may begin seeing how often you have called self-abandonment compassion, how often you have mistaken exhaustion for love, and how frequently you have accepted emotional responsibility simply because you are capable of handling it. That realization can be powerful because your sensitivity was never necessarily the problem. The problem was what you were doing with it. There is a difference between being deeply sensitive and allowing everyone else to use your sensitivity as a place to unload their pain. The period you are entering can begin teaching you that your ability to feel deeply does not have to become a lifelong sentence of carrying deeply. Your sensitivity can become an instrument of awareness instead of a source of suffering. That transformation has been waiting for a long time, and now another feeling may rise alongside it, an urge so strong that it could surprise you. You may suddenly want to destroy everything that feels wrong. Over the next 24 to 48 hours, some people may experience an almost physical desire to make a dramatic break from their current reality. You may imagine quitting your job, ending a relationship, deleting social media, moving to another city, abandoning routines, or simply wiping the entire structure clean so you can finally begin again. If that impulse appears, do not immediately assume that you are irrational. The emotion underneath it can contain legitimate information. The desire for change can be real. The exhaustion can be real. The awareness that something is no longer aligned can be real. But the existence of a real feeling does not automatically mean that an immediate reaction is the correct response. This distinction becomes especially important because eclipse energy can feel volatile and exposed, and Mars has just moved into Cancer, which happened yesterday. That movement can intensify emotional reactions because Cancer is protective, defensive, private, and deeply sensitive. You therefore have two very different currents operating together. Leo carries the fire that wants to separate from what has become outdated, while Cancer carries the water that wants to defend itself, retreat, protect what feels vulnerable, and respond from emotion. When those energies collide inside you, the result can feel confusing. One part of you may want to run toward freedom, while another part wants to hide, defend, or react before thinking. That can create the feeling that something must happen immediately, even when the deeper truth has not fully formed yet. This is why I would not treat every intense impulse as an instruction. Instead, observe it. If you want to leave, write down why you want to leave. If you want to end something, write down what has brought you to that point. If you want to destroy a routine, a relationship, a role, or an image of yourself, put the feeling into words before you turn it into action. Give yourself enough space to hear what the impulse is actually communicating. Sometimes the urge to burn everything down is not really asking for destruction. It is revealing where you have been living out of alignment for too long. The desire to escape may be pointing toward a need for change, but the form that change takes may become clearer once the emotional intensity settles. There is nothing inherently wrong with wanting to leave. There is nothing wrong with recognizing that your current life no longer fits. The important question is whether you are releasing something consciously or destroying something reactively. Those are not the same thing. Release involves awareness. It allows you to look directly at what no longer belongs and make a deliberate decision to let it go. Destruction comes from a moment of emotional overload where the need to escape becomes stronger than the ability to pause. With this much astrological intensity surrounding you, that distinction matters. You do not need to solve your entire life tonight. You do not need to make every decision before the day ends. You may simply need to notice what has become impossible to ignore. Let the feeling speak without immediately allowing the feeling to drive the car. The clarity you are searching for can arrive after the emotional wave has passed, and giving yourself several days for that process can make a profound difference. Trusting the process does not mean remaining trapped. It means allowing your next decision to come from understanding rather than emotional combustion. And while this internal process is unfolding, there is also something remarkable happening above you tonight. For those of us in Europe, the eclipse will be visible as a deep partial eclipse during the evening, and in some locations, approximately 90% of the sun will be covered. That is already extraordinary, but the timing makes the visual experience even more striking because the eclipse occurs as the sun is setting. Imagine standing outside while the daylight gradually changes, watching an eclipsed sun approach the horizon with only a narrow portion of its light remaining visible. The sky itself can appear to mirror the internal process taking place within you, the old light becoming dimmer, the familiar image losing its dominance, and something new waiting beyond what you can currently see. There is something deeply symbolic about witnessing the sun disappear while the day is already moving toward night. It can feel like a visual representation of an ending, not necessarily an ending that should frighten you, but an ending that creates room for another phase to begin. The eclipse also occurs on a new moon, which means the sky can become exceptionally dark afterward. Then, later in the night, the Perseid meteor shower reaches its peak. If weather conditions cooperate, you could experience an extraordinary sequence, watching the eclipsed sun descend at sunset and then looking upward a few hours later as meteors streak through the darkness. One light disappears, and other lights begin appearing across the sky. Whether you interpret that as symbolism, coincidence, or simply a beautiful astronomical event, the sequence carries a powerful image of transition. Even if you are not able to see the eclipse directly, that does not mean the emotional themes connected with this moment disappear. The experience is not dependent on having a perfect view of the sky. Still, if you are able to step outside this evening, slow down, and actually watch what is happening above you, there can be something meaningful about witnessing the moment rather than simply hearing someone describe it. It turns an abstract idea into a personal experience. You are no longer only thinking about release, identity, sensitivity, and change. You are standing beneath a changing sky and allowing yourself to recognize that you are also moving through a transition. And as everything around you becomes quieter, darker, and less familiar for a moment, there is one thing you may begin noticing more clearly than anything else: your own inner voice. Listen to it carefully, because it may be becoming louder precisely because the outside noise is beginning to lose its power. What comes after the intensity may be more important than the eclipse itself, because once the noise begins to fade, once the emotional pressure starts settling, once the illusions have been exposed, and the old identity begins losing its grip, you may discover that the person waiting underneath all of it has been you all along. The real you has not disappeared. That part of you has simply been buried beneath performance, people-pleasing, self-doubt, anxiety, and the constant pressure to become whatever other people expected you to be. Over the next few days, I believe that inner voice can become easier to recognize. It is not the fearful voice that constantly predicts what could go wrong. It is not the voice repeating someone else's expectations. It is the quieter part of you that already knows what you want, what feels true, and what no longer feels right. You may have sensed that voice for months or even years, but it has often been drowned out by responsibilities, relationships, opinions, fear, and the need to keep everything around you stable. What changes now may not be dramatic on the outside. You may not experience some enormous revelation or wake up feeling completely transformed. Sometimes a genuine internal shift is almost invisible. It arrives as a calm certainty. You stop debating with yourself about something you already know. You stop reopening the same decision every few hours because you are afraid of making the wrong choice. You stop asking everyone else what they think before allowing yourself to trust what you feel. There is simply a moment when something inside you becomes quiet, and within that quiet, you recognize your own answer. That kind of certainty can be far more powerful than excitement because it does not need to convince anyone. It simply exists. I believe this eclipse is connected with a return of that inner authority. And I do not mean authority in the form of a position, a career title, a relationship label, or the number of people who notice you online. I mean the kind of authority that comes from knowing yourself well enough that you no longer need constant external confirmation to believe in your own worth. That is the deeper transition taking place. You are not becoming more powerful because other people finally approve of you. You are becoming more grounded because their approval is no longer responsible for defining you. That is the beginning of the new era. Then, on August the 15th, Mercury will conjoin Jupiter in Leo, only a few days after the eclipse, and this can become an important continuation of what has already begun. The voice that has been becoming clearer may suddenly have more room to express itself. Ideas can begin moving more freely. Confidence can grow. Your thinking may feel expanded, as though the walls around your own mind have opened, and there is finally enough space to imagine possibilities that previously felt too large, too uncertain, or too distant. What you create from that mental expansion may feel different, because it is coming from a different internal place. The words you choose, the ideas you develop, the things you begin building, and the way you express yourself can carry an energy that is less concerned with proving something and more connected with genuine self-expression. But there is another moment you need to understand, because the path forward may not remain perfectly clear every single day. On August 17th, Mars will square Neptune, and that transit can bring the sensation of a fog returning. You may experience doubt, uncertainty, confusion, or a temporary drop in motivation. If that happens, do not immediately conclude that everything you understood during this eclipse was false. Do not assume that the clarity disappeared because it was never real. The temporary confusion can simply test whether you are willing to remain connected to the person you are becoming when the emotional atmosphere becomes less certain. Old patterns often become tempting again when clarity weakens. You may feel the urge to return to familiar behaviors simply because they are familiar. But this is where the difference between temporary uncertainty and genuine misalignment becomes important. You do not have to panic every time you feel unsure. You can pause, breathe, remember what you already recognized, and allow the fog to move through before deciding that you have lost your direction. Then, as the month moves toward its conclusion, Venus will oppose Saturn and Jupiter will trine Saturn. Together, these developments point towards something more grounded and lasting. The changes that are truly honest, deliberate, and rooted in reality can have staying power. This is not simply about experiencing a brief emotional high and then returning to the same identity you were trying to leave behind. The possibility here is structural. The identity you begin claiming during this eclipse can become something that remains with you. But there is one part of the process that cannot be outsourced. You have to choose it. You have to inhabit it. You have to stop waiting for another person, another circumstance, or another sign to give you permission to become who you already know you are. Nobody else can make that decision for you. This is the threshold. And whether you realized it or not, everything leading up to this moment has been moving you toward it. Think about what you have experienced recently. The emotional fluctuations, the changes inside relationships, the nights when your mind would not settle, the strange combination of sudden clarity and uncertainty, the moments when you felt as though you understood something and then immediately questioned yourself again. I do not believe you have been moving through those experiences without meaning. They have been part of the preparation for this moment. Even if your conscious mind did not understand what was happening, some deeper part of you may have recognized that you were approaching a turning point. This eclipse is not appearing as an isolated event. It arrives in the middle of a process that has already been unfolding, and that is why it can feel so personal. The version of you that learned to perform for approval, that learned to measure worth through recognition, that stayed attached to relationships and identities long after they stopped fitting, did not fail you. That version had a purpose. It helped you survive. It helped you adapt. It carried you through experiences that shaped the person you are now. But something can serve you for one chapter without belonging in the next one. You can honor who you were without taking that identity forward. What waits beyond this moment is not necessarily louder or more impressive. It may actually be quieter. It may be more honest, more grounded, and less dependent on anyone else telling you that you are enough. That transition can feel uncomfortable because freedom often removes the familiar structures that once made you feel safe. Sometimes becoming more authentic is frightening precisely because there is no longer a role to hide inside. Yet that fear does not mean you are moving in the wrong direction. It can mean you are stepping outside an identity that has become too small. So when the moon moves across the sun today and daylight temporarily changes, allow yourself to recognize what you already know. There is something you have probably been carrying that you are ready to release. You may not need anyone to tell you what it is. Somewhere inside, you may already have the answer. Let it go with awareness. Let it go without forcing the future. Trust that what belongs in your life does not require you to remain attached to what has already completed its purpose. And if you are still here, thank you sincerely for spending this time with me. If this message connected with something you have been experiencing and you want to continue exploring this kind of astrology and spiritual reflection, subscribing would mean a great deal. You can also share what sign you are and what has been coming up for you in the comments. I genuinely value hearing how these moments are unfolding in your lives, because none of us experiences these transitions in exactly the same way. Take care of yourself tonight. Give yourself room to process what you are feeling, and I will see you in the next one.